Chapter 6. I regret to say that I gasped aloud, both in terror and in admiration. Those two emotions seemed always to attend my dealings with my renowned brother. To me, his craggy features were the most handsome in England, his grey eyes the most brilliant, and if circumstances were different. But there was no time for pointless dreams. I fully comprehended all the peril of my situation, and I admit that I felt a strong inclination to flee. Luckily, in contemplation of the bizarre bouquet, I stood so near the wall that it checked my impulse to back away. Had I made such an ill-considered move, I'm sure my brother might have noticed. But he barely glanced at me, although it took me several thudding heartbeats to comprehend why. For there I stood in plain sight, his tall, gawky, long-nosed sister Enola. Until I realized that my disguise had kept him from really looking at me. Indeed, the moment he saw a winsome, coiffed, and attired young woman in the parlor along with Mrs. Watson, he turned his attention elsewhere. One might think he disliked to be in the company with such a woman. And if I gasped aloud, he did not hear it, for at the same time Mrs. Watson jumped with a cry. "Mr. Holmes!" She stretched out both her hands towards him. Is there any news of John?" To judge by his taut and somber face, not any good news. As if capturing two fluttering doves, he took Mrs. Watson's hands in his kid-gloved grasp, but he did not speak, only making a shushing motion with his lips, and threw a warning glance in my direction. "Oh, how thoughtless of me!" Hardly what he meant to convey. He wanted her to get rid of me, but she seemed to feel that she had been rude, forgetting to introduce me. Freeing her hands, she turned to me. "Miss, If one is literally trembling with ill-mixed emotion, one might as well make the best use of it. Relieving Mrs. Watson of the necessity of remembering my name, I squealed, "Is this really Mr. Holmes, the great detective?" Simulating great girlish excitement, I hurried forward, smiling, nay, grinning with like a skull. "Oh, I am so thrilled!" I squeaked, my voice a full octave above its usual level. Even as I quaked in fear that my brother might recognize me, I grasped one of his gloved hands in both of mine. "Oh, just wait until I tell my aunt that I met the famous Mr. Sherlock Holmes." My effusions had the effect I desired. If a sewer rat had crawled upon Sherlock, it might have repulsed him less. He could not bear to look me in the face, turning his head away as he said frostily, "Miss, Everso, Miss Viola Everso," I blurbed. "Miss Everso, will you kindly excuse us?" "Of course, absolutely. I know you and Mrs. Watson, that is, you have important matters to discuss. I'm frightfully honored and delighted to have met you." Twittering in inanities, I allowed myself to be ushered away by the faithful parlour-maid Rose, who had appeared for that purpose with my wrap in her hands. Even after I heard the front door of the Watson residence close behind me, I could not quite really believe my escape. Mincing down the stone steps, I expected at any moment to hear Sherlock shout, "Wait a moment! Enola! Enola! Constable, stop that girl in the wig!" But instead I heard his voice, speaking to Mrs. Watson. "There is no good news, I'm afraid." The words, although quietly and gravely spoken, carried clearly to me through the partially open parlour windows. "But I have found something. I have found Watson's medical bag." I stopped on the pavement where I stood. Oh, oh my goodness! I couldn't simply leave. The sound of my brother's voice acted upon me like a magnet upon needles and pins. I had to know more. But what if I were caught listening? Pretending to search my pockets for something, I glanced up and down the street, which lay quiet except for a milkmaid making her deliveries, and a cab or two. London is odd that way. Slum streets sprawl, always with women standing in open doorways, shouting at one another, children running amok in the muck, beggars, vendors, drunkards, idlers. But the better residential streets lie almost empty. Their scrubbed doorsteps led up to closed doors, flanked by windows without a single broken pane of glass. Instead, one sees potted geraniums, a canary in a hanging cage, a meek little room to let sign lace curtains. but one cannot tell whether one is being watched from behind the lace curtains. Holmes spoke on. I found it at his club, where someone had stowed it out of sight behind a davenport. It remained unnoticed until today. But John would not have left. Mrs. Watson's quiet voice struggled against tears. Exactly. My brother's voice also suppressed strong emotion. My heart swelled when I heard such controlled anguish in his words. No doctor, least of all Watson, would ever be willing to be separated from his black bag. Wary of my own feelings, I realized I was quite likely to betray myself with a whimper or some equally undignified involuntary utterance. Enola, you silly chit, I mentally scolded myself. Get away! I moved, however, only a few steps, just enough so that Holmes and Mrs. Watson would not see me if either of them happened to glance outside. I put myself on a line with the corner of the house and of the parlour. There I stood fiddling with my gloves while I tried to calm my breathing and the pounding of my heart. I could still hear my brother speaking. Therefore, I think we can rule out the possibility of accident. Watson was purposely lured or spirited away by some personal agency unknown. Mrs. Watson's soft reply was inaudible to me. I cannot be certain, but it seems to me that the anti-medical elements, yammering as if surgery were vivisection, tend towards hysteria, and are unlikely to act with such organized decision. Yet although improbable, it remains just possible, as do other hypotheses. Some enemy from Watson's army days, perhaps. I've been looking into that possibility, but my instincts tell me otherwise. Above all, I continue to suspect the criminal underworld, but my informants so far have been able to tell me nothing. It is as if one moment Watson were playing billiards in his club, and the next, the earth opens up. With a tattoo of hooves on cobbles, a delivery van rattled past, the driver glancing at me curiously, probably wondering why I was standing there. In London, any unchaperoned woman who pauses even for a moment to blow her nose puts herself in danger of being taken for a social evil, the polite term for a lady of the night. It is this silence, this hiatus, that I cannot understand, Sherlock was saying when the noise had passed. If Watson was kidnapped, why not demand for ransom? If taken by some enemy, why not gloating message of revenge? We should have heard from such a tormentor by now. Have you anything to report? Anything out of the ordinary? Her reply was brief. Flowers? Said Holmes with a dismissive impatience. But surely such social gestures are to be expected. No. If we are to involve the police, we need something more than a black bag and an anonymous bouquet. Please think. Is there nothing? Mrs. Watson said something in broken tones. It is true, logic suggests no reason why murder might not have taken place. My brother's voice had tightened to the breaking point. And in that case, there would be no communication. Yes, I have thought it too. Yet I cannot give up hope. One must not give up hope. And, he added with a black fire flaring in his tone, I will not rest until I've got to the bottom of this affair. A considerable silence followed, during which another vehicle trundled past. This time a brougham, the driver and occupants eyeing me askance. I felt like a target set up for marksmanship practice. Finally, my brother spoke again. We must persevere. We cannot do otherwise. Can you think of nothing to help me? Silence. Have you had visitors? Other than that syrupy young woman who left just now? Who was she, by the way? Oh my goodness. My nerves could not take no more. I left, walking down the street in the manner recommended by a lady's moral companion. Self-possessed and quietly, with not too much lagging and not too swift a step, looking as if one understood what one is about. Only after I had rounded a corner did I let my breath out. I wondered whether I had now been added to Sherlock's list of suspects. I certainly hoped not. I did not want him to be interested in the syrupy young woman All the more so because he must not waste his time while trying to find out what had happened to Watson. But he was wasting his time, I realized, as I entered a crowded thoroughfare of shops and businesses. Avoid lounging against the shop windows, resolute, forego even the most tempting displays of finery, past men without looking at them, yet all the while seeing them. Brilliant as my brother was at unravelling many sorts of perplexities, he continued to err by neglecting the woman's sphere, in this case, the messages conveyed by the flowers. It seemed to me that a gloating message of revenge had indeed arrived in the form of hawthorn, poppies, convolvulus, and the oddest of greens. Asparagus. The asparagus I did not at all understand. Nevertheless, I felt fairly sure that the bizarre bouquet had not come from the criminal underworld, nor from anyone Watson had known in the army. No, I thought it had come from someone who would not last long in either of those organizations. Someone too odd for them. Someone eccentric, petty, and spiteful in quite a creative way. Someone enjoying an interesting garden variety of gleeful madness. And someone so dedicated to the pursuit of botanical malice that he, or she, grew hawthorn in a hothouse. Chapter 7. But how to find this interesting person? 3 possible schemes came to mind, and while one, locate and investigate hothouses, would take too long, another seemed more hopeful. I immediately put it into action, finding a place to sit down and write. As it was a fine day, I chose a bench near one of West London's new public drinking water fountains, quite as big as most war memorials and surmounted by winged figures. Halfway up its magnificence flared a basin intended, I think, to look like a scalloped shell, but more resembled a fungus jutting from a tree, with a porpoise-shaped spout giving forth refreshment for ladies and gentlemen. Lower down, a similarly ornate trough was provided for the pleasure of horses, and lower, yet near the pavement, a smaller trough for the use of dogs, and, I suppose, cats, rats, and street urchins. Sitting, as I have said, where I could view the intermingled species enjoying this monument to benevolent hygiene, I drew paper and pencil from my pocket and composed the message to be placed in the personal columns of the all London newspapers. After several attempts, I distilled it to greatest simplicity. Hawthorn, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies. What do you want? Replied this column, MMW. The initials stood for Mary Worston Watson, as if the query had been posted by her. Satisfied, I recopied this numerous times for London's plethora of publications. Then, by hopping onto a passing tram, which, as a modern urban woman, I had learned to do without stopping the horses, I paid my penny and was rewarded with a ride to, eventually, Fleet Street. Many a time I had visited the Fleet Street offices of the various new publishers, and had been waited upon politely but indifferently by various mail clerks. This time, however, while even more than usually polite, they seemed far from indifferent. Preoccupied as I was by concerns other than my appearance, I did not at first realize the reason for the change. Oh, for goodness sake! I fumed to myself when I remembered I was wearing a great deal of hair in Lady Be Fair artifice. What fools! After I had delivered and paid for all my advertisements, the day was turning to night, and I was getting quite tired. But I could not yet rest, for I needed immediately to pursue my other scheme to identify the sender of the bizarre bouquet. One does not cultivate hawthorn twined with binderweed, yet, in a hothouse just for a single triumphant moment. Such a spiteful person, I believed, would continue to send his or her messages of hatred in floral form. And when the next one arrived, I wanted to be in a position to observe and intercept. Therefore, I needed to return to the scene. So much the better that night had now fallen. Darkness was to my advantage, lessening the likelihood that Mrs. Watson might see me as I re-entered her street of residence. For additional concealment, I hailed a cab. I had the cab driver pull up directly in front of my destination, and I had him wait so that the cab, a big four-wheeler, stood between me and the residence of John Watson. MD, the house with a room to let sign in the window, you see, stood almost directly across the street from the Watsons. Mentally, I begged fate or fortune as I plied the door knocker. Please, might the room in question have a window facing that direction? It did. Perfect. Perfect, I mean, in that one all-important aspect. In others, it was dreadful, chill-bare and cheerless, with a bed as hard as a board and nearly as narrow, and a flinty-eyed, disagreeable landlady who named far too high a weekly cost. Small wonder the shoes space room had remained vacant until now. I haggled with her over rent and terms, but only for the sake of appearances. The truth was, I could have taken the room for whatever price, and ended up handing over my money and receiving my latchkey within a few minutes. I needed to be in place by the following morning, you see. Already, during the half-day I had spent away, a second suspicious bouquet might have arrived at the Watsons' door. A most provoking thought. But even so, I felt no doubt that the malicious sender would eventually provide another, and when it arrived, I must not miss it. So I had my cab driver take me to Aldersgate, where I dismissed him, and after going in one door of the railway station and out the other, I engaged another cab. Such precautions had become second nature to me. I must never forget that cab drivers can be questioned and that I was a fugitive, with the world's greatest detective taking quite a personal interest in me. I had the other cab then take me to an East End street, where few if any cabs had gone before, that is to say, to my lodging, and I had the driver wait until I packed the things I needed, meanwhile attempting to explain to a rather dismayed and doubtful Mrs. Tupper. I am going to visit my aunt for a few days. Eh? She lifted a herring trumpet to her ear. I am going to visit my aunt. Eh? With her watery old eyes widening to the utmost, she still could not understand, yet would not venture nearer to me. Standing in the doorway of my room, watching a lovely young lady throw clothing into a carryall, knowing that for the past month the girl who more resembled a scarecrow had barely stirred from the room, I am sure she wondered whether I had gone mad, whether she ought to summon a constable to have me committed lest I constituted a threat to the body public. Eh? Going where? At this time of night? Going. Visit. Aunt! I shouted into her ear trumpet. With a satchel in each hand, I whisked past her out the door. The next morning, Sunday, found me applying rogue birthmark, powder, etc., in order to face the day in a lovely ladylike guise. Quite a nuisance, this new disguise. All over London, women readying themselves for church were struggling less. But at least my wig did not yet need to be restyled atop a bedpost, for I did not wish to put it on the hot, heavy thing until necessary. It perched at the ready with its hat still pinned in place. So as not to be seen without it, I made the loathsome landlady bring my breakfast upstairs, leaving it on a tray outside my door. Meanwhile, corseted to simulate an hourglass figure and wearing quite a fetching puffed and pleated Paris green day dress, I sat in the window with a pair of opera glasses close at hand, watching the street in general and the Watson residence, in particular while taking advantage of the concealing qualities of lace curtains. As regarded concealment, only my precipitous arrival made it necessary. After a few days, it wouldn't matter if Mrs. Watson saw me about. Indeed, I might approach her and tell her how fortunate I had been to see the room to let sign on my previous visit, just when I was looking for a new lodging place. And was there any news of Dr. Watson? On the other hand, I had quite hoped this vigil wouldn't last as long as a few days. For even within the first few hours I had become exquisitely boring. Nice streets were too quiet. A scattered procession of cabs with Sunday licenses, scrubbed and shining in order that cleanliness might actually contain godliness, brought various neighbours, including Mrs. Watson, home from worship. Mrs. Watson, I noticed, took a few moments to pat the cab horse. Rare was the woman who would do that, especially at the risk of besmirching her Sunday best. I regarded Dr. Watson's winsome wife with mingled admiration and pity. She wore black, as if already she were in mourning. After the churchgoers had gone indoors, nothing at all happened for an hour or so. Eventually, a bent old woman in a shawl limped from door to door, selling violets from a large flat basket. That was all for the next half hour or thereabouts. A water wagon passed at a trot, the horse with tail handsomely lifted, pleasing to watch, until one realized the nag was littering the length of the street with horse apples. Ironic, as the purpose of the water wagon was to clean London streets, typically covered with muck, for a respectable slug would not have crawled in it. The labour of clearing it would not have paused, even for Sunday rest, for there were a great many horses in the city, and each one produced 45 pounds of waste per day, or so Mum had once told me. Don't think of Mum. To distract myself, I tugged at the tasteful opal brooch, centered upon my dress front, thus drawing the slender dagger sheath in the busk of my corset, the opal being its pommel. Hefting my weapon by its hilt, I felt reassured I had once used it on a garrotter. Although once an attacker of a different sort had used the knife on me, but my corset had foiled his attempt to stab me. Thus convinced of the value of corsets, I had provided myself with several specially made, so that their metal ribs did not nib my waist or jab at me under the armpits, only protecting me from the likes of Jack the Ripper, while supporting the bust enhancer and hip regulators which disguised my stick-like figure, while serving as carryalls containing emergency supplies, plus a small fortune of Bank of England notes, courtesy of Mum. Do not think about Mum. Hastily slipping my dagger between the buttons in the front of my dress, returning it to its sheath in my bosom, I set myself to take mental inventory of the other items therein. Bandaging, scissors, iodine, spare stockings, needle and thread. In a best blue cape and bonnet, a nanny walked past on the street below, pushing a parasol perambulator with one hand, while with the other she led a toddler in a lacy pink dress and white pinafore. Yawn. Headscarf, hair extensions, pince-nez, eyeglasses for disguise, lorgnette by the way of magnifying lens, smelling salts, sugar candles, biscuits. Around the far corner of the street approached a small, ragged boy carrying a bunch of flowers nearly bigger than he was. Inventory and anew, at once forgotten, I grabbed for my opera glasses and peered through them, trying to identify the blossoms in the bouquet. But the boy, confounded, ignorant street urchin, carried it under his arm, head down as if they were likely to bite him otherwise. I could hardly see the flowers at all, and had to content myself for a moment with memorizing the boy's scruffy plaid clothing and rather stupid face. He paused with his mouth open to study each house number. Very possibly, he might not be looking for the Watson residence at all, might not concern me whatsoever. My heart pounded in protest at the thought. Nonsense. It has to be. It was. After studying the number beside the door at ordinate length, he turned to ascend the steps of the Watson residence. Only then, as he put his back to me, I could catch a clear look at the flowers in the bouquet. Laburnum, harebells, convolvulus again, wispy sprays of asparagus again, sprigs of yew. Ye gods! Dropping the opera glasses, I sprang up, popping my wig, hat and all onto my head, snatched my mantle and ran out of my temporary lodging and down the stairs, intent on catching that boy as soon as he had completed his delivery. Chapter 8. Laburnum, you see, while a very pretty flower, hangs down in yellow cascades, weeping. The blue harebell, long associated with fairies, bad luck and fey events, means submission to grief. The yew is a graveyard-side tree, signifying death. So even if it were not for the convolvulus and the asparagus fronds, I would have felt sure these flowers came from the same spiteful source as that other bizarre bouquet, and might not this evil-minded person be responsible for the disappearance of Dr. Watson? I scooted downstairs and out of the front door and onto the street as quickly as possible, but only to find the confounded fish-mouthed boy who had just approached the Watson residence so very slowly, now trotted off at a goodly pace, just disappearing around the opposite corner. Oh no, No, he was not getting away from me. Snatching up the front of my skirt with both hands, I ran after him. I am long of limb and love to run. I have always been the disgrace of my family, running, climbing, and generally acting like a biped. But that accursed skirt slowed me down even as I hoisted it to my knees. For doing so denied me the proper pumping action of my arms. Other parts of my personage compensated so that my head wobbled and I swayed from side to side, although I am sure resembling a tall Paris green goose in a tremendous hurry. Onlookers regarded me with shock. I remember speeding past the lady who stood like a pillar of salt, with both silk-gloved hands to her gawking mouth. And as for gentlemen, how my display of my lower limbs affected them I can scarcely say, for let a lady in an evening gown ever show so much bosom, still not an inch of ankle must ever peep from beneath her skirt. But I did not care what I looked like or what anyone thought, for as I sprinted around the corner I spied the street urchin cavorting along, not too far ahead of me. "Boy!" I called to him. Pleasantly enough, I thought, and I fully expected him to turn and stop, and we'd have a nice little talk, and I would give him a penny. But instead he took one look at me over his shoulder, his lacquered eyes widened, and he tore off like a hare before the hounds. The stupid little bounder, whatever was he frightened of? "Boy! Nincompoop! Wait! Come back here!" Without breaking stride, I sped after him, gaining on him easily, stunted little slum-bred rat. I could have shot him within a moment if he had not made towards Covent Garden and dodged into streets filled with traffic. Rather than keeping to the pavement, he took to the cobbles, dashing between potato wagons and carts and cabs, and almost under the hoofs of coach horses. Here, being born and weaned in the city, he had a great advantage over a country girl who had never been much accustomed to ducking omnibuses. He led me a jolly good chase until I finally lost sight of him entirely. Stopping at the corner where I'd last seen him, I stood hot-faced and panting, one hand hauling up my skirt, while the other I disciplined my wig, which felt as if it were about to take leave of my head. Confounded thing, no matter how annoying. I should have put it on beforehand and secured it with hairpins. Too out of breath to mutter the naughty phrases that came to mind, I looked about me in every direction with no idea which way to turn. I nearly gave up. Actually, I did give up. With a sigh of exasperation and defeat, I let my skirt, which parts of it were not already sodden with horsemuck, drop at last to decently cover my ankles. Then, ignoring the stares of dressed to be seen in Sunday strollers, I applied both hands to the problem of the slipping wig, trying to restore some order to my appearance. I lifted it to straighten it. "Don't!" screamed a high-pitched voice. Startled, I looked for the source of this terrified plea, and discovered the street urchin, the self-same boy I had been chasing, staring at me with huge eyes from his hiding place inside one of the crates, meant for displaying dry goods, flaking the closed door of the corner chandelier. Standing where I was, I had unknowingly blocked his escape, but I might never have seen him had he not cried out. "No, please, don't," he wailed. I stood, immobilized by astonishment, with a hand at each side of my wig. "Don't what?" I blurted. I could not imagine what he was so afraid of. He shrieked. "Don't take your hair off. Don't take your nose off either." "Oh," I said, nodding slowly and wisely, as if he had explained everything. Obviously, the boy was a half-wit and needed to be approached cautiously. Taking care to make no sudden movements as if faced with a cornered animal, I let my wig lapse back onto my head, in whatever fashion it so desired. "All right," added in easy, soothing tones. "No harm done. Would you like a penny?" Reaching into a pocket, I pulled out a handful of coins. Hearing the jingling sound and catching sight of the shiny metal, the lad seemed to calm, or at least shift the focus of his anxiety, as I had thought he might. "I just want to talk with you a moment. Will you come out?" I coaxed. "No." "Why, then, I'll come in if you don't mind." I simply plopped myself down to sit on the pavement in front of the grate, in which he cowered. Fatigue alone, I would think, would not have made me do this, although I was quite fagged from running, but I found the absurdity of the situation irresistible. All around me I heard horrified gasps arise from onlookers, and I sensed how they stepped away, as if my extraordinary conduct might spread some sort of contagion. Just 2 years before, during the Queen's Golden Jubilee, a lady had sat down on one of the pathways within the Crystal Palace in order to place a sprig of fur onto the top of her boot. Not long afterwards, she had been committed to a madhouse by her husband. Not uncommonly, a woman might be put away in a lunatic asylum for insane conduct such as reading novels, going to spiritualist meetings, quarrelling, failure to obey, etc. Having one's wife taken off by body snatchers in a black baroque was a respectable recourse should her presence become onerous, whereas divorce was a scandal. It was quite a good thing that I planned to have no husband, I thought, smiling and still panting from running mad. Seated knee to knee with my quarry as if we were two children playing tea time, I told the filthy little street savage, "How do you do? I am very pleased to meet you." As if selecting a bonbon, I lifted a penny between my fingers. "I could not help observing you taking quite a lovely bouquet of flowers to the Watson residence just now." Warily, the boy counted. "Don't know, no, Watson," but his gaze had fixed on the copper coin. "How did you know which house, then?" "The man told me the number." "What man?" "Why, the man who took off its nose." My mind began to feel as fagged as my legs, but only nodded slowly and sagely once more, deciding to circumvent the nasal improbability for the time being. "And how did you happen to meet this man?" "He called me over." The lad demonstrated a beckoning gesture, just such as any person of any consequence might use to summon any boy loitering on the street, if the latter wanted to carry a parcel, take a message, hold a horse by the reins, or render any simple service. "Was he in a gig or a dog cart?" I inquired. "No, he were right in a right shiny carriage. He were, with horses." Refraining from telling him that a dog cart was also a horse-drawn vehicle, I merely asked, "A phaeton? A brougham?" "Don't know about no broom. A fine black carriage it were, with yellow spokes to the wheels." A description could apply to half the vehicles in London. I tried again. "Did you see a coat of arms?" "Sure, he had a coat on the arms and two, both arms and hands. He gave me the posse with one and Tuppence with the other." Losing his fear of me, the lad had become more loquacious. A good thing, as I found myself rather at a loss, trying to question this boy with a head too large for his stunted body, and intelligence too small. What did this man look like?" What like? What's any tough like? Just a long-faced tough and chin whiskers, and a topper, except he took his nose off." And there it was again. He took his nose off. I strove to keep incredulity out of my tone. Apparently I succeeded, or else the horror of the memory had taken such a hold of the boy that he could not help but speak. All in a rush, he said, "Knocked it off against the door. Like when he stuck his head out and gave me the flowers. It fell in his lap, and I don't know what scared me worse, that nose lying there, the way he grabbed it and cursed me and shook me at it, and told me to take the flowers right smart, or he'd come after me and do the same to me and pull out me eyes into the bargain." Did you see any blood?" "No." The lad started to tremble. "No more of his face was made of wax." "What did he have there where his nose should have been?" "Nothing. What I mean, it was just holes, like a skeleton." The boy shivered. "Holes?" But the lad had gone into a convulsive fit of shuddering. "Please don't take your hair off, or your ears, or nothing." "Oh, for goodness sake, why would I?" "Did the man put his nose back on?" "I don't know. I ran. I took his flowers just as he said. And then you came chasing me." The street urchin started sobbing, not the usual forthright roar of a young barbarian, but a wail of soul-felt distress. His odd encounter apparently had upset him considerably. What were you chasing me for? Never mind. I rose to my feet, aware that each well-bred person passing by gave me a long stare and a wide berth, and handed the child a sixpence instead of a penny, for I felt sorry to have caused him distress. Evidently there was no more sense to be got out of him. Sense? What sense was there in anything I had learned? Chapter 9. Returning at once to my temporary lodgings by the most inconspicuous route, I rang for hot water. While I washed, put on a clean dress, sponged the skirt of the soiled one, and tidied my hair, that is to say, took off my wig, combed it out, and pinned it up in an acceptably attractive fashion, I thought, or tried to think, but succeeded only in wondering how the man had lost his nose. I vaguely recalled that, sometime during the Renaissance, there had been a colourful Danish astronomer who had lost his in a duel. But dueling was done with pistols now, not swords, and it was banned in England, although still practised in the more backwards little countries of the continent. I supposed one could possibly get one's nose shot off by a pistol. The Danish astronomer, I record his name now, Tycho Brahe, after his duel, had worn a nose made of sterling silver. I wondered why he had not chosen gold, which could hardly have been in worse taste. But I suppose people thought differently about such things before the reign of Queen Victoria. I supposed, now that I thought about it, there were likely a number of men in England whose faces had been similarly altered, if not in duels, then in wars, the Indian Mutiny, the Second Afghan War, that sort of thing. Surely they did not wear silver noses or chins or ears, as the case might be. What? There came a timid knock at my chamber door, and my landlady's girl of all work, a wretched wisp of a child who could not have been more than 10 years old, asked, "Will you dine, Miss Everso?" "Yes, I will be down directly." While my current landlady's disposition was in wretched contrast to Mrs. Tubber's, the meals she served were far superior. Meanwhile, I set the girl out for the evening papers, and when I returned to my room after an excellent dinner of roast lamb with mint sauce, I turned up the gas. What luxury to have such ease and effectiveness of lighting, even though the pipes hissed and muttered like a mumbling lunatic. Seated in the least uncomfortable chair, I read all the papers, checked first to see whether there had been any further developments in the Watson case. None were reported, and second, to make sure my personal was included. Hawthorn, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies. What do you want? Reply this column. MMW. It was. Interesting, I thought, at the centre of the bizarre bouquets. Letting alone in the matter of his nose for the moment, should be a man. Flowers were generally considered to be in the female domain, although of course there were always a few eccentric amateur scientists, followers of Malthus and Darwin, trying to cross-pollinate orchids in hothouses. Also, upon further reflection, I suppose that any man who had ever courted and or married necessarily learned something of the language of flowers. How fortunate for me that both my brothers were confirmed bachelors, thereby remaining ignorant. Undoubtedly Sherlock, keeping an eye on the personal advertisements for any demand regarding Watson, would notice Hawthorn, convolvulus, asparagus, and poppies, and be intrigued, possibly even thinking, quite mistakenly, that it had something to do with Mum and me. I doubted he would guess nearer to the truth. In any event, I had hoped for a response of some sort from the Hawthorn man in the morning. Meanwhile, I scanned the newspapers. I had been too busy to read this morning's and yesterday's. There were quite a lot to go through, and no particular reasons to do, except for the discipline of keeping up with the news. But after a while I found myself reading without comprehension, and occasionally one must make allowances. Yawning, I decided that after I finished looking at the agony columns of the Pall Mall Gazette, which I was reading at the moment, I would go ahead and throw the whole lot into the fire. And then I saw it. 422-555, 4151444, 3342-445, 42351542545, 3532513451, 35325143, 23532551, 55531534, 31323455441145, 34325113, 31533. Oh, oh my goodness. Suddenly wide awake with my heart thumping, I reached for paper and pencil. First, I jotted down the alphabet, thus, in groups of 5 with 6 in the last. Then I started on the first word, fourth line, second letter, Q. Second line, fifth letter, J. Q, J. Realizing my mistake, I started over. Fourth letter of the second line, I. Second letter of the fifth line, V. Fifth letter of the fifth line, Y. Ivy. Yes, it was for me. The gaslight whispering in its pipes now sounded like a ghost in the room. A painful yet incorporeal corset tightened round my chest. I found it difficult to breathe properly as I continued deciphering, but it did not take long to complete the task. Ivy, desire, mistletoe, where, when, love your chrysanthemum. The best and worst of all possible messages. It seemed I could no longer put off thinking about my mother. I slept very little that night. Indeed, I had not left all of my warm, concealing dark clothing behind in Mrs. Tupper's. I would have attempted to sleep at all. I would have roamed the city in search of those less fortunate than I, to give them food and shillings, and think less of my own difficulties. Such nighttime questing was very much a custom of mine. A pox on Viola ever so for keeping me from it. Instead, I needs must lie on a hard and narrow bed while my thoughts refused to be still, chasing round and around like noisy and undisciplined children. Was there no order left in the universe? Mum had never initiated communication with me before. Always the other way around. It was a trick, just like the last time Mum, actually my brother Sherlock, had arranged a rendezvous, except that now Sherlock had caught on to the code of flowers, saying mistletoe instead of a meeting. But surely Sherlock would not be wasting any time on me right now with Dr. Watson missing. Perhaps it really was Mum. If so, my mother must be in some sort of terrible trouble. But wouldn't she name her own time and place if she need to see me if she were urgent? If someone were setting a trap for me, letting me choose where and when, wasn't that a way of luring me in? Strictly speaking, Mum should not have said mistletoe. That meant a tryst between a gentleman and his paramour. Mum should have said Scarlet Pimpernel. Unless Mum simply thought Scarlet Pimpernel was too much to encrypt. She could have put Pimpernel, a word no longer than mistletoe. Was that not what she would have done? Was the message fake, not from her at all, a trick? But why? And by whom? It was in the Pall Mall Gazette and no other newspapers. In Mum's favourite publication and no others. It had to be from Mum. I wanted it to be from Mum. I wanted to see Mum. Yes. No, I was angry at her. For good reason. Ivy, desire, mistletoe, where, when. Love your chrysanthemum. The message said, love. Mum had never in her life said such a thing to me. It was a trick. It was what I had always wanted from her. Either the message was false, but from whom? Or else my mother had found some affection for me in her heart after all. If I did not respond, I would always wonder. And if I did respond, I would be risking myself and my freedom for the sake of a single fickle word. When one does not know what to do, prudence might decree that one should do nothing. But I cannot bear such inactivity. Hence my penchant to wander the night, and lacking the release. At dawn, after a most sleepless night, I got up and prepared to go out, even though I had no idea where or for what purpose. I donned my corset, armament, supplies, munitions, petticoats, then a frock sufficiently flounced, frilled and ruffled and beribboned to promenade city streets, and went on to beautify, in other words, totally disguise my face. All the while my mind continued its intermingled, romping circles. Was the encrypted message truly from my mother? Should I reply to it? What would I say if and when I did? For the time being, much as I disliked indecision, I would wait. That much I knew for the time I had come to call upon Mum for assistance. She had made me wait, and wait, and wait some more. Indeed, she had not responded at all, and my resentment was such that I felt I ought not to see her until I disciplined my feelings, lest I say something I might regret later. But at the time, if she were now really and truly reaching out for me, and I did not respond, what if she had been ill and only had a brief time left to live? What if this was my last chance to make my peace with her? Nonsense. If Mum were on her deathbed, she would hardly be asking me to name the place and time for a rendezvous. But, and but, and but, and so my thoughts ground round and round, until like a male ox they had worn their own tired path. I had all but forgotten about the missing Dr. Watson, the forlorn Mrs. Watson, and the sender of bizarre bouquets, he of the most particular and immovable proboscis. Yet, as I glued my little birthmark onto my temple, up from some hidden kitchen in the cellar of my mind, came elucidation on a silver platter, answering my barely asked question of the day before. What did men with faces disfigured by combat do to ameliorate or conceal the defect? Like a dumb waiter opening to display a tray of nuclears, common sense served the answer. If one needed to, why not a false nose or ear, or whatever realistically made of flesh-colored rubber, and where would one obtain such a thing? Surely at one of the establishments dealing in face putty, skullcaps and other theatrical paraphernalia, or perhaps even at the store where I had bought my birthmark and my wig. Pertolotes, which used to be Chanticleers. Salvation! Needing something to do right now, I would call there.